Good morning, and congratulations for finding the room. Thank you for joining today. Do we have any training professionals in the audience? Great, okay. My name's Phil LeBrun. I'm part of our enterprise strategy team, so we work with the C-suite and boards of directors of many of AWS's largest customers. My job's quite simple. My job is to help you make your own mistakes, not someone else's. So what we do is we often share lessons learned, best practices, things we've seen in other organizations around topics such as migrating to the cloud or designing cloud-native architectures. But one of the hottest topics, particularly over the past couple of years, has been that of skills. And I'll talk a little bit about why. Could you take the slides to the first slide, please? Thank you. Let's give this a moment. While we do that, out of curiosity, how many of you eat at McDonald's? Oh, it's an honest audience. That's fantastic. I've been at AWS 5 years, but prior to this, I was at McDonald's for 31 years in various technology roles. And it's a massive training company. We found it was one of the keys to success for the organization is how do you scale training across a large organization? It's the same question as we're asked today, particularly with the new technology. Here's the opportunity we have with technology today, and it's particularly important now we've seen generative AI hit the headlines and also hit the C-suite and board of directors agenda. We've seen on the board of directors' priorities over the past 2 years, technology become a number 2 priority, and skills number 6. I wish it was a little bit higher, but at least these topics are being discussed at the senior levels of organization. If you look back over history, what we find is when new technology comes along, there's a couple of phenomena that happen. One is there's an opportunity to have all boats rise. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, for instance, we saw GDP grow, health improve across nations, longevity improve, and the general level of education as well. That was the Industrial Revolution. We have a very similar opportunity now with technology if we so choose to take it. But there's also this phenomena based on history called Martek's Law. And what Martek's Law tells us is when a new technology comes along, be it a steam engine or electricity or the internet, nothing actually changes. It's only when we reinvent how work gets done in organizations and we equip all of us with the new skills needed and use the new technology that we see a profound impact on things like productivity. If you think about your organizational structures today, I'm sure many of you have those very familiar silos and hierarchies and layers of managers, division of labor, jobs broken down into discrete job descriptions. That came from the Industrial Revolution. And at the time, that was revolutionary. Doesn't work quite as well today, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But it's also a time of uncertainty. While there's this great opportunity ahead of us, what we see is there's a lot of conversation around automation of a lot of what we do, whether it's generative AI, machine learning. We also see a need, a growing need to actually change the skill sets we have. And if you think about your own careers, there's probably been this sort of incremental improvement you've had in skills. What we're now starting to see is a pretty significant shift in what skills are required in organizations. If I look at my own career, when I went to school, I had no idea what I'd do. I entered the workforce, and by the time I got to the stage I am now, I've done 6 jobs which simply didn't exist when I was a kid. The role of CIO is relatively new. And more recently, the CDO, Chief Data Officer, Chief Digital Officer. Does anyone have a Chief AI Officer? There's a few of those popping up. So we see this invention of new jobs to accommodate the technology that's coming to market. The other thing I find really interesting is if you're in the 1960s, a skill set you may have acquired would probably have lasted about 20 years. Not quite your entire career, but not far off. Today, the average skill set lasts about 5 years. And I think in technology, that's probably a bit optimistic. We've seen this rapid iteration of skills and new roles being created. And the reason that's important, if you think about your own career from childhood through to where you are today, this is what it sort of looks like. So as a child, I'm sure many of you asked your parents, why is the sky blue? Why? All of those annoying things parents had to deal with. But you had this innate curiosity. You genuinely wanted to learn how the world worked. You didn't have assumptions about how things worked. So you asked a lot of questions. But then you go to school, and your field of study narrows a little bit. And a lot of school is about rote learning, so you can pass exams. Then you go to university or college, and your skill set narrows, so you get deeper in a particular skill set, but you lose some of that breadth. Then you enter your new job, and you'll probably acquire some new skills as you enter the workforce. And then you become the boss, where you're the expert. You don't need to do training anymore, because you have all of the answers. That was the old assumption. It's a very linear process. And if you look at this from a learning perspective, when you're a kid, you're learning a lot, not just through schools, but one of the most effective mechanisms for learning still remains what we call play. But your rate of learning declines over time. So now contrast that to the fact the average skill lasts about 5 years. So this idea that you have these discrete stages of your life where you learn, you work, you retire, those days are pretty well numbered, and they have been for quite a while. And it's very easy for organizations to say, my employees need new skills, but this actually starts at the top. I don't know if you see this in your own organizations, but often at the C-suite and board of directors, technology is treated either as a dark art, which is outsourced to someone else, make the problem go away, or it's magic. Do you remember a few years ago the answer was blockchain? Is anyone actually using blockchain? We actually see some great use cases with it in supply chain. But a lot of that started with this fear of missing out, a new technology. What are we using this new technology for without defining the problem? So you have these two extremes within leadership. And you can actually quantify this. If you look outside of the scope of the IT leadership roles, CIO, CTO, and the such like, less than 24% of the C-suite have enough technology knowledge to do their job. Not to do a technology job, to do their job. Can you imagine hiring a chief marketing officer who doesn't know how to use data to target and segment customers and personalize? Or a CFO who doesn't understand data? So there's actually a massive need at the C-suite level and board of directors to upskill as well. At the board of directors, depending on who you believe, that number is about 6 to 13% of board of director members have enough technology knowledge to do their job. And just increasing the number of directors who are technology fluent, not experts, but are comfortable with technology, just as they're comfortable with finance and leadership, doubles your opportunity to talk about technology as a strategic asset, not just as something you talk about at the board around cyber risk. So this upskilling starts at the most senior levels of organizations. It's one of the things that brought me to Amazon. In Amazon, we are a learning organization, and that doesn't just mean we do training and learning. It's actually baked in to the day-to-day work. Things like retrospectives, for instance, lessons learned reports. How do we raise the bar? You'll hear a lot in Amazon. How do we learn from what happened so we can continue to improve this event, for instance? That's a learning organization. And I'll come back to that point in a minute because it's quite important in terms of how we view training. There is a lot of training out there, particularly for technologists. We have our Machine Learning University, for instance, our Skill Builder program, over 600 courses for free available. We also have some executive education. I'll share those QR codes towards the end of the presentation. I'm a believer if we have a belief that generative AI or ML is going to transform organizations. That needs to start at the top. And it starts at the top by engaging in learning, sending a signal to your organization that this is important. A few years ago, we announced we were going to upskill 29 million people with cloud skills by the end of 2025. We blew past that. I think it was June this year, we're at about 31 million. That's free training to create cloud fluency. And there's a number of other programs out there too, specific to AI. This is becoming particularly critical because I'll give you one example. We did a survey, one of the largest surveys done on the impact of digital technology across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. What we found was, within the European Union, for instance, there's a $3.4 trillion opportunity through to 2030 if we can use the technology. The number one issue, by a long way, was skill sets. Being able to acquire the skills in an organization to actually make that vision reality. The other interesting thing that stood out to me is, I think we often have some of these hardwired assumptions about who's willing to learn. Maybe the younger generation wants to learn more than the older generation. What we found through this report is there's an equal appetite from baby boomers all the way through to Gen Z. There's a desire there to learn. And the question then is, how do we give people an opportunity to learn? That's what we'll dive into in a bit more detail. Because what it isn't is just sending people on training courses. I find it fascinating, over the past 10 to 15 years, the amount we spend per head on training in large organizations has barely shifted. So in reality, with inflation, it's probably gone backwards. And this at a time when new skill sets are desperately needed in organizations. So formal training has a place in the whole learning curriculum, but it's not the single answer. Because often what happens is we send everyone on a course, they come back, and then they resume what they were doing before. And if you don't use the skills you've acquired within 3 months, you forget almost all of those. If you can use those skills when you come back to the workplace, you retain almost all of those skills. So training courses are foundational, and they give us the language around things like agile or cloud or generative AI, for instance. But alone, they're insufficient. This is complex. Did anyone as a kid buy a book called How to Ride a Bike? You read it, you got on the bike, and you pedaled off in the distance? Probably not. You get on the bike, you fall off. You get on the bike, you fall off. And you get more and more competent over time. You go through this learning process. A learning process very similar to many of your, let's say, agile processes in your organization, with your retrospectives, with a mentality of learning fast. Let's build stuff, get it into the hands of the customers, and see what works and what doesn't work. And that's the mindset we take with training. This isn't a linear, read a book, go and apply it, job done. There has to be the ability to actually learn how to apply these skills in your day-to-day job. And that only comes from using these skills when you go back to the workplace. There's a question I'll come on to answer in a minute, though, which is one of the issues I hear a lot is we don't have time to do this. Or we'll do training when we've done the real job, the real work in an organization. These can be integrated. You can make training part of the day-to-day workflow in an organization. Let me give you one of the mental models we use. There's a gentleman by the name of Peter Senge who wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline. And the fifth discipline talks about how do you build a learning organization. He talked about 5 attributes which companies do well when they think about this. The first is systems thinking. Going back to the bike example, some problems are complicated. Fixing a bike, you can read a manual, figure out how to fix your bike. It's a complicated task, but you can learn how to do it very simply. With a lot of what we're doing, we're actually engaging in systems thinking, which is complex. You do one thing, and something unexpected happens. You adjust, something else happens. It's this continual iteration. My belief is most transformations in organizations that work are that very experimental way of changing your culture, changing how people acquire skills. It's not a 5-year plan to become a learning organization. This is about tweaking your DNA so you're making continuous improvements in organizations. And part of this is I talked about the Industrial Revolution and those silos we've created. I'm sure this looks vaguely familiar for many of your org charts. You hire talented people. You put 42 levels of leadership on top of them to tell them how to do the job you actually brought them in to do in the first place, and to make sure they're slowed down in doing the job. Sounds familiar? This actually worked really, really well when you were manufacturing 10,000 nails a day or 400 cars. Very cookie-cutter approach because it was a complicated problem. The challenge now is much of what we're doing, many of the problems we're trying to solve in organizations, in our knowledge organizations, require a different approach, a more iterative approach. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Amazon structure and what we call 2 pizza teams. This idea that you put a cross-functional team together, and it's no larger than can be fed on 2 American-sized pizzas. Don't try this with any other pizza, it has to be American. And you set that team a task, an outcome, and you let them get on with it. I've worked in these organizations in my previous job and in Amazon. They're amazing because this is actually a small learning organization. You've set them the task to achieve an outcome. You haven't told them how, though, because you probably don't know if it's a complex problem. And then you encourage a mindset of experimentation. It's a great way, we find, of learning. The second thing that's seen in learning organizations is there's this shared vision. There's this great Alice in Wonderland quote, if you remember the books, where Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, which path do I take? And the Cheshire Cat says, where are you going? Alice says, I don't know. Well, any path is going to get you there. And the reason that's important, there was a study done a few years ago. It was quite depressing. It said about 2% of employees in large organizations understand their company's purpose and priorities. So you've got all these talented people coming into an organization wanting to do a good job, but what they consider a good job is perhaps different to what others consider a good job because they aren't aligned around the vision. One of my favorite stories around this, just to illustrate how simple it is, because these aren't big issues to address, but they're absolutely foundational, is when John F. Kennedy went to NASA in 1963, he bumped into a janitor. And he said to the janitor, what do you do? If that janitor was in many organizations out there, he would have said, I clean the floor where the boss tells me to. But he didn't. What he said was, I am part of the team that is going to put man on the moon. I think that's incredible. If a janitor feels attached and part of the mission of your organization, how powerful is that? It's a massive alignment across your organization. And it's simple to do. But sometimes we get into some interesting... I wonder if anyone's got those purpose statements that we're going to be a platform-based, data-enabled, generative AI-driven organization that leverages our customer synergies to drive omni-channel connection with our customers. Go look at your own purpose statement. You may find there's a few Dilbert-like phrases out there. So this is about bringing clarity to what good looks like, because a learning organization has to have direction. The third area is, clearly, you need the expertise. This is what you need to actually be able to drive the organization and use things like new technology in the first place. Here's a provocative statement. 30% of time in organizations should be spent on learning. Does anyone have Thursday afternoons and the whole of Friday free at the moment? Probably not. We get very busy. And I'll talk a little bit about how to free time up. But think about where learning happens in the workplace. It happens in retrospectives. It should happen in meetings. Your status meeting could become a learning opportunity, a coaching opportunity. Managers providing coaching for their employees. Each one of those is actually a learning opportunity if addressed right. And here's part of the problem. And it'll be interesting now post-COVID whether this is still such a big issue. The workplace has become a place to perform, to be seen to be doing things by the boss. What we think is it needs to go back. If we're truly knowledge-based organizations, which many of yours are, we need to go back to the workplace being a place to learn, to experiment, to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and to advance the organization. For the last 30 years of my career, I've thought about skills in 3 buckets. One is the obvious one, which I think we normally talk about, for instance, with the cloud, which is what I'd call the functional skills or technical skills. And they're not necessarily IT technical skills. If you're an accountant, there's technical skills behind that, or a marketeer. So a bunch of skills. These are probably the easiest ones to identify. The second set of skills, though, are business skills. I think this is important because many of your employees today know how your organization really works, who to call to get something done, how you make money. But often we don't invest in people to give them that opportunity. We had Indra on stage yesterday, the former CEO of PepsiCo. Former CEO of PepsiCo was talking about attributes of leaders she looks for. Humbleness, curiosity, asking questions. But she also said, as a CEO, she spent time on the front line in factories with drivers to really stay connected to the mission. We did the same at McDonald's. Often we become so detached from our own business. So that in itself is a set of skills. And then finally, there's what we call immutable skills. These are the really interesting ones because in my mind, immutable skills are skills which literally won't change regardless of what happens with the technology. No one's ever going to come to your organization and say, we need to communicate more poorly, or we need to find different ways of not giving feedback. And we don't invest in these in a lot of organizations. One of the most powerful things, if you have your 2-pizza team and you're experimenting, one of the most powerful skill sets that team needs is the ability to challenge each other, to ask questions, to provide feedback, to improve the product they're building, not to criticize each other. Often we don't train people to do that. We feel very uncomfortable. One of my favorite leadership principles in Amazon, learn and be curious. A couple of things to call out here. It starts with the word leaders. This isn't about a set of people in your organizations. It's about leadership on downwards. I met a CIO recently, and he was talking to his peers in Germany. He made a really interesting statement, which is if your CEO is talking about turning your organization into a generative AI organization, and he or she's never written a prompt, they should shut up. Direct quote. And his point is, this technology now is accessible to everyone. There is no reason leaders shouldn't acquire simple prompt skills, to have empathy and understanding about how generative AI can be used. The same's true with data. But it's also essential, if you are going to grow your organization, you are going to be doing things which have never been done before, certainly not done before in your company's context. And that's where curiosity is so important. So one of the things we hire for is a demonstration of a desire to learn. So one of the questions I was asked when I joined, when I was going through the interview process is, give me an example of how you learn. What did you wish you did differently in terms of learning? Fourth is mental models. Mental models are really about how we process information. Many of the decisions we make are automatic. Can you imagine analyzing what you're going to have for breakfast? How much sugar has this got in it? Should I eat vegetables? It would tell you to starve. So we have these automatic ways of making decisions. Oatmeal sounds good. Should eat 5 vegetables a day. But those mental models can become stale. So we always look at, how does an organization make decisions? And this is another element at the heart of a learning organization. Let me give you an example of how we run experiments in teams in Amazon. We have a set of beliefs. We think we know how something works. We have a set of assumptions, some of those conscious assumptions, some of those not. So instead of launching into a project plan, we actually do what you probably did in chemistry at high school. You create a hypothesis. This is what I believe is needed. You test the hypothesis. You see what the results are, and you reflect, and you adjust. That's a single loop. Here's what we often miss. What did we learn about our process of learning during that? What did we learn about the assumptions we make in our own mental models about how we're making decisions? And it's something called double loop learning. So it's not just, hey, the project failed, what should we do differently next time? It's, why did it fail? What assumptions did we make at the start that led us to this situation? So it's another technique for learning about how you're processing information in an organization. Yeah, a very simple example, we have what we call correction of errors. If there's an issue, it doesn't need to be a technology issue, it could be maybe a team dynamic issue. We very deliberately go through a process to learn about what went wrong. And we do this in a psychologically safe environment. This isn't to find someone to blame. It's actually with the genuine intent about how do we change our mental model for that team, but also engaging leaders so those learnings are then taken into other teams. So teams make their own mistakes, not someone else's. Final element, and this is a really interesting shift, I find. If you look at the Frederick Taylor structure with silos, and you reflect on your HR processes, we hire individuals, we reward individuals. We give performance reviews to individuals. In the 1800s, 1900s, that made a lot of sense. You said you were going to produce 600 widgets, you produced 500. What went wrong? Or you produced 700, congratulations. The individual was actually the generator of an outcome. It's no longer true for everything we do. Much of what we do, there's no single individual in an organization that alone can achieve a meaningful business outcome. So one of our beliefs, and it goes back to why we structure in the way we do, is the fundamental learning unit, the fundamental delivery unit in an organization is now a team. And if we sort of drill into that a little bit more, that team is incredibly powerful. We talk about things like loyalty to a company, trust in a company, psychological safety in a company. None of that actually happens. Trust is individual, and psychological safety is when I'm in a room with the team, do I feel safe to actually say something? It's hardwired into our brains over the past 10,000 plus years. So that team is also a unit of learning. And what helps there is how much autonomy does that team have? If you tell the team what to do, if you micromanage them, they're not going to learn. And they've got a great scapegoat too. If things go wrong, it's your fault. If you give them sufficient autonomy to explore ways of doing things, that becomes a learning opportunity. Something else that triggers learning is us humans like complex problems. We like problems that are interesting and meaningful and aligned to a purpose. Most of us don't want to go in and do a job. We actually want to do something meaningful. So this idea that you give teams complex problems to solve, and it's clear how that ladders up to your purpose, that also helps to create this learning unit, this unit of the team. And some of the things that those teams do when they do it well is debriefs, retrospectives, sharing your mental models. We use tenants in Amazon. So every team, every initiative will have 7 or less tenants. And what it does is it makes explicit how we're going to make decisions. Often we come into a room to make a decision, and maybe I'm the CISO, I'm thinking about security, and one of you is app dev, and you're thinking about story points, and someone else is infrastructure, thinking about something else. And we never actually agree what's our mental model for making decisions. And then finally, how do you create psychological safety? Because at the end of the day, the most powerful tool to help an individual is feedback. But that feedback has to be given in a way that it's seen as a gift to you. It's something to help you, not to criticize you. Easier said than done. I mean, that's really hard. Giving what's termed negative feedback is difficult for even some of the most senior leaders. Now, let me just knock through a few myths, because what we often hear is we get all of that, but we can't do anything because we're different. Number one is we can't afford the skills. Part of the reason we hire in the way we do, and that we hire for our leadership principle, learn and be curious, is we don't know what skills are required in 10 years' time. We know they'll be different. So how's your recruitment process, how's your hiring process and interview process actually paying attention to someone's learning aptitude? We find, it's really an interesting stat in organizations that as little as 10% of your organization delivers 50% of the results. And then if you apply that to talent management, I'm sure many of you use the 20-70-10 distribution curve, stack ranking and the such like. In IT, who's the top performers? In finance, who's the top performers? What organizations who are learning organizations do well is they actually move that talent across the organization. So if you're in finance and you're top talent, and you've got a digital initiative that's being driven in another part of an organization, maybe you should be on a secondment there. It helps you understand the business, but it also aligns your very best people to your most important priorities, rather than sticking to this very rigid silos we have. The other thing organizations do well is they invest in strategic workforce planning. What I mean by that is no one becomes a Python developer overnight. But if you look, maybe you've got a mainframe. Hopefully, in 5 years' time, you won't have a mainframe. So you know skills like COBOL, for instance, may not be as relevant in the future. So how do you start planning a career path for the COBOL programmers you have to acquire Python skills? And I've seen this with mainframe teams. Sometimes there's this belief, well, the mainframe team, they're all 70, and they've been working on this system for many, many years, and that's all they do. They're actually, there's some incredible people there who really understand your business, who have a big aptitude for learning. So if you start to lay this out, it also helps with change management. If people see what the future is, what skills they can acquire in the organization. And I always think about training as a P&L. A colleague of mine, formerly from Netflix, Adrian Cockcroft, was once accused when he was at Netflix by a CTO of stealing people from Netflix. It's all right for you. You've got the best engineers. And Adrian said, I've got the same engineers as you did. I recruited them from your organization. I just got out of their way. And I created an environment where those individuals felt they could learn. There's a massive cost of not creating a learning organization. And I'll come back to that one in a moment. Secondly, you don't have time. You're all incredibly busy. There was a really interesting survey done, I think it was about a year ago, by Harvard Business Review, and it was simple. They went out, met a bunch of employees and asked them a single question. How's it going? It's like one of those cat adverts. 8 out of 10 people said. 8 out of 10 employees said, we're busy. Some reason we've started to treat that as a unit of productivity or a measure of productivity. If you're good, you're busy. But if you also look at it, if your best people feel they can't get things done in your organization because of complexity, they're the first ones to leave. So some of this is about decomplexifying your own organization. There's a stat that says, it's called Parkinson's Law. Parkinson's Law says, bureaucracy grows 5 to 7% a year if you do nothing. It's like compound interest, but undesirable. So you almost have to be anti-bureaucratic. Where are you hemorrhaging time? Because it's one thing we cannot replace. And yet we waste incredible amount of time in organizations doing all sorts of weird stuff because we've always done it that way. What I found really interesting, this was some data around about COVID, when obviously workforce pivoted to different ways of working. And in doing that, look at these numbers. Suddenly people started to spend more time facing out towards the customer and more time learning. They weren't caught up in the machinations of status reports, PMO reports, VMO reports, governance meetings, steering meetings, pre-steering meetings, executive readouts. They've got back to focusing more of their time on things that actually mattered. And yeah, this is actually really pertinent now in an era of generative AI and machine learning. Probably more pertinent than when we started thinking about this topic 3 years ago, which is how do you redesign work itself? Let's not say we're going to automate 22% of John's job, because it's not as if John can give up an arm. But you can redesign his job to make it more fulfilling and then use automation to help decomplexify the stuff you need to do but doesn't add business value. So how do you automate work? How do you optimize work? But really sort of diving deep about what does it take from the moment someone has a bright idea to how long it takes to get into the hands of the customer. And you can find up to 80% of an IT budget in an organization is spent on just keeping the lights on. Up to 80% of someone's time can be spent on doing things which doesn't advance the organization. The worst report on developer productivity said developers in large enterprises spend 5 hours a week developing. So by Monday, just after lunch, you're done. And then we hear, we don't have enough developers. They're in status meetings, waiting on QA and the such like. So an immense amount of complexity. If you take that out, you can then reassign that time to learning, to things of value. Third myth we hear in organizations is, I can't get the right people. Now, some of this is, we've seen this vast shift in skill sets, particularly with generative AI, with machine learning, with all of the excitement around that. So there is some catch-up to do there. But in general, our belief is quite simple. You do have the right people in your organization. Do you want to hire someone who's a brilliant data scientist but doesn't understand your business? Or do you want to take someone who really understands and cares about your business and turn them into a data scientist? Both work, but that second option is the one I've seen traditionally more successful. And here's what, this was a real job description that passed my desk at McDonald's years ago. Must have a 4.0 GPA, 3 degrees, wasn't quite written like this. It's a bit extreme, but transform 2 global companies with artificial intelligence. You're almost looking for a unicorn. And you must have an MBA too, because then we can screen out a load of candidates. So what's really needed in the job? Some of this stuff is just tradition rather than necessary. So we go off and hire these unicorns. Or the other thing we do, and some of you may have gone through this, the current organization knows nothing about digital, so we'll set up a digital organization. We'll hire a bunch of people. And then you get this, and it sort of works for a while, but if you don't manage it, you end up with actually more friction in the organization. Your traditional organization thinks, well, you digital folks, you think you're special, or data, or whatever the topic du jour is. And then digital folks come in and say, we're here to save you. Doesn't really generate a good environment for feedback, or not the feedback you want anyway. So our belief is the team you have is probably the team you need. They probably just don't have the skills you need. So how do you address that? You start this gradually. Identify those skills that are required. And some of this will be through experimentation in the team. Provide training where it makes sense. External support, so things like pair programming, for instance, we've used to great effect in the past, which has accelerated developers' time to proficiency writing code for the cloud. But coaching's also an underutilized skill. We talk a lot about mentoring. You come to me, ask a question, I give you my sage advice. But the reality is I'm probably detached with what's really going on. So as a leader, being a good coach, asking good questions, has a profound impact on people's learning and attachment to the workplace. Fourth one, and this really annoys me, our people don't actually want to learn. I don't know who these people are. I rarely meet someone who says explicitly, no, I've stopped learning, done all the learning I need to do. There's normally something else wrong there, some disconnect. I remember in the 80s, I was sent on a total quality management course because everyone was doing it. It was trendy. Many of you have probably been on lean engineering courses, Six Sigma, Agile, and you send the entire organization on it. because it's trendy, and then they come back and go back to working as normal. But here's mentally what happens with new skills. And it's actually based on something called the Kubler-Ross grieving cycle. The emotions you go through when you go through change, particularly profound change in the workplace, are the same emotions you go through when someone close to you dies. So let's take an example. You're a rock star data center engineer. You've been doing it 25 years. You can do it in your sleep. You've been rewarded for it. You are the renowned expert. And then I come along and say, good news, we're moving to the cloud. Your reaction probably isn't going to be, great, that sounds like it invalidates all of my value to the organization. I'm excited. It's not normally the conversation that happens. You go through denial. You've probably heard this, seen this in your own organizations. We don't need the cloud. We built a private cloud. Our data center is better than the cloud. And then after time, there's fear. I know nothing about the cloud. Will I have value to the organization or not? And then hope. It's hard work, but you start to get this thing. You have to think about it. You haven't got those mental models yet. But finally, given time and given coaching and given space to learn, you become a rock star cloud engineer. And this is nothing to do with technology. This is about any job. The reason I share this is we often do an awful job helping people through that grieving cycle. We say things like people are resisting change. They're probably scared. You've probably, I bet $1 that most of you have been through this multiple times in your career. I have, going from a developer to a project manager to a director to, am I going to be any good? And then changing technology. I know nothing about this. So these are perfectly normal human emotions we have to help people through. And here's what helps. Sometimes we don't pay attention to learning, and we almost incur an organizational learning debt. And to make up for that debt, we send everyone on a bunch of courses at the last moment. You've got a program that's going to go live, and we need people who know Python. Let's send everyone on a Python course, and when you come back, you're going to have to deliver on this thing that's written in Python. It doesn't work very well. So you get into this panic zone where you're not having time to figure out how this technology works. Too often you're in this comfort zone where you've stopped learning. Not consciously in the main, but you just stopped it. You've been busy. So how do you actually get your organization into a mode where every week, incrementally, you're learning something as an individual, as a team, as an organization? It's a far better way of transforming an organization than going through a big, jarring transformation program. Today, you're a project manager. By the end of the year, you're going to be a scrum master. Here's a course. It doesn't work. I mean, you have to sort of figure this stuff out with your team. I'm fascinated by rewards, too. There's this thing called McGregor's Theory X, Theory Y, and it's all about, and another one called Hellsberg's two-factor. It's all about motivation, dissatisfaction, what drives people. And Theory X says people are motivated by things like money and fear of punishment. Doesn't really actually hold water. What drives people in the main is you want purpose, you want autonomy, you want mastery, you want skill, you want to feel like you're doing something more than just a checkbox job description. So when we think about how do you reward skills, often it's as simple as recognizing people who've actually acquired those skills. Maybe there is a career path which you lay out, which is explicit about the skills you need, and that becomes a reward in itself in terms of if you acquire these skills, then there's the opportunity to move up in the organization. But if you sort of dissect your organization, this can apply to many, many different things. But when there's a change, typically about 10 to 15% of your organization are what we call early adopters or innovators. They're the people, if you go to them and say, hey, we're moving to the cloud, they'll say, oh, that sounds exciting. And they go home and start self-studying. What they want is the opportunity to do that, the recognition from you that they're developing skills, the ability to maybe coach some of their peers in those skills. About 40% of your organization is what we call the early majority. These are the folks sitting there thinking, here we go again. Last year it was blockchain training, this year it's cloud training. Next year it's going to be generative AI training. Yet the reality is, what they want to see is, how does this connect to the company's purpose? Why is this skill set you're asking me to acquire useful? Is leadership role modeling this? If we're going to become a data-driven organization, do I see my leaders using data to make decisions? So they want to know you're serious about it. And then about 40-ish, 45, 50% of people are late majority. These folks are a little bit scared. And by the way, no individual fits neatly into any of these. It depends on what the change is. You could be an innovator for one change and a late majority for another one. But these folks, they want to know what the skills are. Are you going to invest in them? What's their career path? They're a little bit concerned because they don't have the skills at the moment, and maybe you'll replace them. Final myth: if we train people, they'll leave. I love this skit. I think I stole it from LinkedIn, but I'm worried if I train my people, they'll leave. You should be a little bit more worried if you don't train your people, they'll stay, and they won't have the skills you need. So there's a skill shortage out there. We all actually have an obligation to invest in our people. We often say glibly, people are our greatest assets, as if we're a depreciable building. But then we don't back that up with the skill sets and the training and the such like. So this is an element I love about the cloud. There's many reasons organizations have moved to the cloud, but think of it from a learning point of view. I can experiment, very low cost. I can spin things up. I can try blockchain or machine learning or AR or virtual reality. I can actually use the cloud as a platform to learn. It lowers my cost of experimentation. I can use it to get rid of some of that undifferentiated work to create space for me to become a learning organization. So getting people hands-on with the technology is an essential part of this. Two things to wrap up on. I just want to briefly go through some of the macro changes we see over the past 100, 150 years, and then some practical things you can do. So we've talked about education is now continuous. I had a great statement yesterday from Indra, which was, if you stop learning, you can't be a leader. The two are linked. Second one is, rather than going off on large training courses, sometimes that's the right thing to do. How do you create micro-learning? How do you build training into the workflow every day? Some of that training is things like training people on feedback. So every day, you can help people get better by giving them constructive feedback. Also realize people learn in different ways. What may work for one person, online, at-home, remote training, may not work for someone else who may want to be in a classroom environment. So how do you create multimodal training for these individuals? And then using the team as a construct for that learning. How do you create a learning organization within that team? So there's many things you can do with skills. You can retain your skills as is. There's going to be skills which don't change in your organization. We know that. You can upskill individuals, which is much of what we've talked about. You can reskill individuals. But also identify what skills don't you need anymore. For some reason in organizations, we tend to send people on the same training course, and then 20 years later, someone says, but we don't even use this process anymore. Why are we still sending people on Lotus 1, 2, 3 training classes? You can recruit for new skills. That's absolutely a part of this. You want fresh perspective, fresh skills in your organization, but it shouldn't be your sole lever to pull with this. And then redesign roles too. You really pay attention to the job description. In the world of automation and the such like, how do we construct human jobs which are meaningful, not just automate away parts of the job? I love this quote because I think it sums up the opportunity we all have. It's a choice, whether we want to learn or not. There's nothing stopping us. It really is a choice each of us can take. Here's 5 things you can look at if you haven't started your learning journey yet. One is, we run a learning needs analysis out of our training and certification team, for instance, which from a cloud perspective helps identify where some of those gaps are. Think big about the skills. What does your organization look like from a skill sets point of view in the future? But then how do you take those baby steps to get there? How do you start to acquire those skills? And it goes back to that 2% of employees don't understand the purpose and priorities. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Why are you changing these skills? What's in it for me? As an individual, I may get why you're doing it for the organization. What I'm really interested in is, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my career path? How do I acquire these new skills? Why are these skills even necessary in the new world? Second one, we talk about diversity in all sorts of ways. Diversity of thinking and experience is important. So bring junior people into teams. I've seen some great examples of reverse mentoring. Because of this gap with technology knowledge at board and C-suite, some organizations have set up almost shadow boards of directors of more junior folks with some of the skills to help then the current board of directors acquire those skills. So it's not just about pushing training down in the organization. It's actually, how do you use the folks you've got to actually train your senior folks in the organization? Thirdly, actions matter. We talk about single-threaded leaders. A single-threaded leader is that one person who's going to wake up every morning and think about an outcome. Are we making progress? What do we need to do to make progress? Often learning gets sort of shoved in the corner in HR or a different organization. It's one of those sort of by rote things we do. Have we spent our training budget this year? Yes or no? What training budget do we need next year? It sends a powerful signal. If you're genuinely vested in creating a learning organization and reskilling, if everyone knows who's that person who's waking up every morning thinking about how do they move the needle. The natural reaction to that is everyone's too busy, but then how do we become unbusy in organizations? Expose senior leaders to the technology. Don't make this about the people just doing the work. Bring people down to the front line. Hackathons, for instance, have been very effective, or boot camps, where leaders can actually get hands-on with the technology. And as a leader, here's the worst thing you can do from a psychological safety and trust point of view. If I give you autonomy, and you make a mistake, and my first reaction is, why didn't you ask me? I've just taken away all of that autonomy. The right reaction is, what did you learn from that mistake? What aren't we going to do? That double loop learning. What assumptions did you make that didn't stand up? Role modeling those behaviors is essential, otherwise people won't take them seriously. Create a culture of learning. Again, this is not just about technology. Do people actually know how you make money in your organization? Go back to my old company. How does McDonald's make money? Well, you can say it's hamburgers, but there's also royalties because it's a franchise business. So really understanding the business basics and exposing everyone to those. Just like, let's train non-technologists in security. We know the single biggest attack vector remains us people, social engineering and the such like. So some of these really basic courses, but to get everyone speaking the same language. And make learning fun. The highest performing teams I've worked with, you can tell they're high performing because you observe two things. A lot of shouting and a lot of laughter. They're shouting because there's a passion, a collective passion about solving a problem. They're not criticizing each other, they're attacking the problem. And they're laughing because there is that teamwork, there's that team bond that's been developed over time. That's always a good sign that you've got a team there that is genuinely vested into doing something good for your organization and willing to learn and give each other feedback to improve. And then, what about career paths? I mean, for many of us, my career path was fairly traditional in technology. Hey, Phil, you're a good developer. I don't think anyone said that, actually, but Phil, you're a good developer. Your next step is to become a project manager. How do you give the skills you need in organizations long-term, how do you give people career paths which keep them attached to those skills? Things like, principal engineers in Amazon, for instance, may not have a team, But engineering's such an important skill set. There is a career path for that. They become mentors and coaches for their next generation. They're the ones that get involved in the really, really complex problems that need to be solved. So how do you build career paths? And there are things like communities of practice. A thing with communities of practice, though, is they have to be something people want to do. It can't be a management mandate that we're going to have a community of practice. Find people who are passionate about this. They'll create that network and bring people in. There's a bunch of stuff we do to help here. My team's set up to help at a senior leadership level in rethinking things like skill sets, organizational design, why cloud, why data, what is generative AI. So a lot of it is actually education. We've got our Skills Guild partner network. Many of our partners bring those skills into your organizations, either through their people or through training programs, and then training and certification. One organization I worked with in Australia set the goal to have 100% of people with their cloud practitioner certification. You could argue not everyone needed it, but it sent a message that this was important. Even the executive assistant had her CPC. And then finally, there is a bunch of training out there. It's all free for executives too. So tailored by persona. So what is cloud for CMOs? What's generative AI for executives and the such like. It's real easy, very short, but at least it starts to embed some of the language of these technologies in the organization. So with that, thank you so much for your time. Please provide feedback. We're always, we're very data-focused organization. We're a learning organization, so I appreciate any feedback you've got in the app. And thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the show this week.